from Urban Ecology Solutions, and also, I guess, co-hosted by Lahontan and Audubon Society. So I just want to let you guys know a few things about Lahontan and Audubon Society if you're not aware, a few things that are going on. We have upcoming board elections. So if you're at all interested in joining the Board of Trustees, please let me know or shoot an email through the website, through the contact information on the website, and we can give you more information about what exactly would be asked of you, and any questions that you had about that. Additionally, we have another talk this week on Thursday. It's at 7 p.m. and it is on Intro to Birds of Costa Rica. And that is going to be hosted by this guy named Mario, who is going to be leading a field trip to Costa Rica hosted by Lahontan and Audubon Society. And he's going to be talking about that field trip and just talking in general about some pretty cool birds that you can see in Costa Rica. I saw some pictures yesterday and I was like, I don't know any of these birds, but they're all awesome. So if you are at all interested in that, make sure you check your email. If you're not a member of Lahontan and Audubon Society, you can send me an email or you just chat me and I can send you some information about how to sign up for that. So with that, I will just introduce a little bit about Carrie. So she is a landscape architect and environmental educator. She's a native Nevadan and has a bachelor's degree in environmental studies with an emphasis in education from San Jose State University. She has worked for environmental nonprofits and environmental consulting firms in the area of education and landscape architecture for over 15 years. And currently she runs her own consulting company, Urban Ecology Solutions, LLC, which is an environmental education consultant for One Truckee River. So I will throw it back to you, Carrie. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all for taking some time out of your evening on this lovely spring day for this class on promoting pollinators in your river-friendly landscape. And I think this is perfect timing because spring is just coming up. So hopefully you guys are excited about learning about pollinators today. And this class is hosted by One Truckee River with funding from the Western Regional Water Commission. And just to start out, I thought I'd give you an introduction about One Truckee River in case you haven't heard of this organization. It is a partnership within our community of different nonprofits and agencies that are all working together as one to manage the Truckee River, hence the name One Truckee River. In 2016, formed a management plan that dictates how the Truckee River should be managed. That was ratified by the cities of Sparks, Reno, and Washoe County. And that plan has many different objectives and goals, and we're going to be covering a few of those this evening. The first is to ensure that we're delivering the cleanest water possible into our storm drain system. The second is to promote wildlife habitat and its connectivity and integrity throughout the entire watershed. And the third is to ensure that we are fostering a culture of stewardship, making sure that everybody in our community is working together to care for the Truckee River. And we're meeting those objectives by starting this new program this year called River Friendly Landscaping, which you may have learned about at our last meeting. I gave an introductory course on this initiative. It is an adult education initiative targeted at homeowners to teach them about how their practices in their landscapes can affect the Truckee River and how we may change those to help protect the river. River-friendly landscaping involves 6 major principles, just to kind of give an overview. The first is to keep water on site. The second is to reduce pollutants. The third is to use water wisely. The fourth is to build healthy soils by adding organic matter that helps soils to retain moisture and promote healthy plants. The fifth is to create wildlife habitat. And the sixth principle is to prepare for wildfire. And tonight we're going to be diving in a little deeper on that fifth principle of how to provide wildlife habitat. And we're really looking at pollinators because we don't want to necessarily promote really big wildlife like bears and mountain lions in our landscapes, but we certainly can make space for some of the beneficial insects and birds. So we'll be diving in deeper on this topic tonight. And to start out with, I thought I'd cover what is a pollinator, just to make sure we're all on the same page there. A pollinator is anything that helps carry pollen from the male part of the flower, the stamen, here on the outside, into another flower's stigma on the inside to help pollinate it. And the most common ones people are familiar with are honeybees, but there are lots of other types of pollinators, including our native bumblebees. And just as a fun fact, if you live in the Great Basin, which we all do, the Great Basin is home to about a quarter of all of the native bee species in the United States. So it's kind of a biodiversity hotspot for bees. Other pollinators include insects like this hoverfly, as well as beetles. And of course, moths and butterflies like this hawk moth shown here. And hummingbirds as Audubon Society members. I'm sure you're all familiar with these guys. And also lesser known are bats can be pollinators, like this lesser long-nosed bat, which pollinates the saguaro cactus in the deserts of the Southwest. And why are pollinators important? Well, to start off with, they help support the whole bottom of our food chains or food webs. They feed spiders, reptiles, amphibians, freshwater fish, and an astonishing 96% of terrestrial birds. And I'm sure most of you are familiar, but a lot of general public doesn't realize that baby birds are really dependent upon a high protein diet that consists of insects. So if we want to be able to support our bird populations, we really have to support the bugs. And just to kind of give you a perspective of how many insects we're talking about, there's a recent study done by the University of Delaware that tracked pairs of Carolina chickadees and counted how many caterpillars they took back to their nest to raise a clutch. And they found numbers upwards of 5,000 caterpillars in order to get a clutch of chickadees raised and out and fledging from the nest. So 5,000, that's an incredible number. So we really have to support large numbers of insects to support our bird populations. Pollinators are also important because they provide pollination for 90% of flowering plants. And that includes 75% of crops that we depend upon. And another way to look at this is that 1 out of every 3 bites we eat required a pollinator. While there's lots of different plants like wheat and potatoes that don't necessarily need a pollinator, the fruits and things that really add spice to our lives, like this watermelon, would all require pollination from a pollinator. So they're very important in adding variety to our diets. And as you may have heard, pollinators are in decline, or there's great concern among entomologists globally about this issue. It's been all over the news and on the front pages of many prominent publications like Science, National Geographic, and the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. One of the populations we're probably most familiar with and have heard a lot about is the monarch butterfly, like this one that's shown in our local sensory garden at Idlewild Park. And we've seen declines in these populations over the last 20 so years. The Xerces Society has been monitoring populations of the population that overwinters on the Pacific coast. And back in the 90s, they were estimating populations over 1 million, not shown here in the green. So all the green bars are the number of butterflies that they counted during their Thanksgiving count that they do every year. And unfortunately, if you go all the way back down here to 2020, last Thanksgiving, they found less than 2,000 butterflies or monarch butterflies on the Pacific coast in all of the sites that they monitored. And that's what the blue line indicates, is how many sites were monitored. So despite the fact that they looked at more sites than ever before, they still found such low population. So it shows a general decline in this species in the Western population. Another intensive study with regards to butterflies has been happening in our backyard here. It's one of the longest and most intensive records of insect populations that's ever been done. And it was started by Art Shapiro. Sorry, I blanked on the name there for a second. Art Shapiro, shown here on the right, from UC Davis. He started this study over 45 years ago and has been monitoring across a cross-section, starting down in the Central Valley and following along the I-80 corridor up into the Sierra Nevada mountains at 10 different sites up the elevation profile, looking at butterfly populations. And those that study, as I said, has been taking place for over 45 years. And Matt Forrester here on the left here from UNR, his team has been helping with the data collection of that in the last couple of years. One of the sites is right in our backyard here up at Castle Peak above Donner Lake. And at this site, they have found declines in the butterfly population since 2011. So this global issue that everybody's looking at can really just be seen here locally as well. And although bugs like butterflies and bees really get most of the attention, there are other insect populations that may be in decline as well, such as mayflies. They're particularly important to aquatic ecosystems because they form the bottom of the food chain and supply food for many of the fish species. A study by the National Academy of Sciences found a decline of 50% in mayfly populations in the Lake Erie, Upper Mississippi watersheds since 2012. So there's great concern about their declines as well. And so the next question that everybody has, I think makes sense, is why is this happening? We're seeing these declines on populations across the globe. Why is it happening? And one of the first things that comes to mind is that there's many contributing factors, but one of them may be climate change. Many insects are dependent on temperatures and precipitation patterns, and those have been shifting rather quickly, as we can see from these diagrams from NASA, on ecological timescales. So like it may seem like a long time to us, 1884 to 2020, but on the face of the earth, that's not a very long time. And to see these temperature changes over that short a period of time is really causing may have effects on insect populations. Another contributing factor may be invasive species encroachment. And this includes species like cheatgrass, that's the brown or kind of red tinged grass that you can see here in between the native shrubs. This has become very dominant across the Great Basin. And it not only takes up space for a lot of native plants that would normally be there, that native insect populations depend upon, but it's also changing ecological regimes like the frequency of fire within these ecosystems, which can also affect pollinators. Another contributing factor is habitat destruction. And much of this has to do with our development model of suburban development that moves out instead of up, that's been kind of dominant in the United States since the 50s. We're still developing in this model generally about 2 million acres a year. And just to give kind of a scale of how much is that, how much is 2 million acres? Well, it's about the size of Yellowstone Park every year that we're losing habitat to this kind of housing development, which is dominated by houses and also the infrastructure and roads that are required to get everybody out to those homes, which includes impermeable surfaces we talked about at the last class, and how those affect our river systems. But the other portion are the yards, which are dominated predominantly by lawn or turf grass. And there's estimates that the amount of turf that we've installed across the United States is about 40 million acres. And just to once again give you a scale of what that means, it's a little more than half the state of Nevada. So if you took out sod and rolled it out and covered over the state of Nevada all the way from the northern border with Idaho down to about Tonopah area, that's how much of the United States we've lost as far as natural habitat to lawn. Another contributing factor to the decline of pollinators is likely pesticides. Rachel Carson warned us with the publication of Silent Spring in 1962, of the compounding effects that pesticides can have up the food chain. And there have been great gains in regulation of pesticides, but there is still a standard management practice for controlling pests, and they can have indirect and direct effects on native insect populations. And while there is debate among scientists about what exactly the causes are, it seems like there's many, and I've heard say that it's more like a death by 1,000 cuts, that there's lots of different contributing factors. But I just want to read this quote from Matt Forrester at UNR, because I think it kind of sums it up pretty well. He says, "Insects, like every bit of the natural world, are declining, but it's clear insects have a possibility to rebound. It's grim, but it's not too late." And that's really where this talk comes in. And I really like that sentiment, because I don't tell you about the problems without kind of giving solutions. So I want everybody to take with this the sense of urgency and also a sense of agency, that we can make a difference and bring things back around. So how can we do that? The first thing we can do is, in our river-friendly landscapes, we can create habitat. We basically want to bring out that welcome mat and welcome the pollinators in. We want to provide food, water, and shelter. So we're going to go through all those 3 major things that insects need. And the first is food. This is probably the most interesting. And as we talked about, part of the problem is that we've got all of these lawns. And when you look at a lawn or a typical suburban landscape, if you looked at it from a bug's perspective, it's pretty much a food desert. There's not a whole lot of floral resources. It looks like this lawn might have an occasional dandelion in it, but pretty much nothing else as far as nectar and pollen. So one of the things we can do is to move away from this monoculture and bring back in the diversity of different types of plants that insect populations depend upon. And when we think about bringing in that diversity, also how we arrange it can be really helpful to pollinators. If we install plants in clusters of the same species, all clustered into groupings, then you can think about it as creating kind of a bug buffet. Because when insects go out to forage, it takes energy to collect their food. And it's easier for them if they can collect it kind of like a buffet, where you just roll down the aisle and you keep loading stuff on your plate. If you make it really easy for them and have the plants clustered together, then they can just go from flower to flower to flower without expending a lot of energy and get more food. So that can be really helpful for them if you install a pollinator garden, is to make sure that you install plants in clusters so that the insect that finds that plant it wants doesn't have to go far to collect. It's also really important to think about providing floral resources with that pollen and nectar for as much of the growing season as possible. So getting plants out there as early in the spring, all the way through the summer, and trying to eke out as far into the fall as possible. And while there's tons of different examples of plants that you can use that will achieve this, I'm going to go through a quick selection just to give you an idea. And after the talk, I am going to be following up with an email with some more resources and lists of other plants to consider. But just to give you an idea, I'm going to start out in the springtime, like today, with fruit trees. These are some of our earliest blooming plants. We're seeing that right now. I've seen pears and cherries and different things starting to bloom. So if you can provide either ornamental or just flowering and unfruitful or fruitful fruit trees in your landscape, that can provide resources for pollinators in the very early spring. There's also a lot of native wildflowers that flower rather early. Some examples here: penstemons. Have the Rocky Mountain penstemon on the left, which is great for bumblebees, honeybees. And also we've got the firecracker penstemon on the right, which is great for hummingbirds. Lupins are another species that blooms rather early in the spring. And then as we move into the early summer, there's lots of wildflowers that go off around about June here. And there's lots to choose from. I just show some of the easiest examples that you can do from seed here. On the right, there's yarrow and blue flax. And then on the left, one of my favorites, bee plant. All of these can easily be started from seed in your garden, and they go off in around June-ish. And I would be remiss to not mention milkweeds, because they are a host plant for monarch butterfly. And so I've got two examples here that can be used in the garden, the showy milkweed on the left and the narrow leaf milkweed on the right here. And I do want to mention, when it comes to using milkweeds in the landscape for our monarch butterflies, do you want to make sure that you're picking species that are native to the local region that you're looking at planting in. A lot of nurseries, they've become aware that they need to supply milkweeds. There's a demand for that because people are excited about trying to help the monarch butterfly. But that doesn't mean that what they're supplying are native to that area. And you want to make sure you're installing natives so that they flower at the right times to aid the monarch in their migration. So if you plant a species that's native to the East Coast, over here on the West Coast, it might not flower at the right time. So just keeping that in mind, you want to try to still stick to native species to like the Western US when you're planting those. Moving through the summer, there's lots of sages to choose from. We've got the Russian sage here on the right and the clary sage on the left, and there's many to choose from. They're great for pollinators. There's also lots of buckwheats. Some of my favorites, they're native species, and there's lots of different buckwheats that grow in Nevada. Unfortunately, there aren't very many that are really available at nurseries, but this one, the sulfur buckwheat, can be found. So if you do find it, it's great for pollinators. And evening primrose shown here on the right, those are great for moths because they flower in the evening, hence their name. And moving deeper into the summer, lavenders, lots of Mediterranean plants are really great for honeybees and other pollinators. And anything in the sunflower family are going to be great for pollinators. This is just the common annual sunflower, and there's lots of other ones to choose from, like blanket flower or black-eyed Susans. There's a whole plethora. Pick something in the sunflower family. And then as we move into the fall, there's lots of other choices. You've got the California fuchsia here on the right, which is great for hummingbirds, and that flowers in the fall. And on the left, we have the globe mallow. This one flowers throughout the summer, but it tends to go longer into the fall than a lot of the other native wildflowers, and does pretty well in landscape settings. Goldenrods in the fall are great for pollinators, as well as any of the asters. Once again, more to choose from, or many to choose from. And I have to mention, even though I know people don't particularly like rabbit brush because many are allergic to it, it is a great pollinator plant. And it flowers in the very end of the fall, so it gives those resources at the end of the season for a lot of our native pollinators. So not that you want to install your whole landscape with rabbit brush per se, but including one or two here or there where you have the space, it can be really great for pollinators. And you may have noticed that I talked about many native and non-native plants as this general seasonal example that I just gave. And I just want to take a note or a moment to talk about that topic, because you can use both native and non-native plants to provide food or pollen and nectar for adult insects. But when you choose a non-native plant, you really need to look at it from the perspective of an insect. And the classic example I have here are hybridized rose versus a wild rose. And if you were an insect looking at both of these plants, which one is easier for you to access the nectar and pollen? It's pretty obvious, right? The native rose has it out there for the insects, like, here, have dinner. Whereas the hybridized rose, we've modified those plants to have traits that are beneficial to us and we find beautiful, but they don't necessarily provide the resources to insects we might be wanting to provide. So just if you're looking at non-native plants, try to look at them from the bug's eye view and pick maybe grandmother's variety or older varieties that aren't highly hybridized in general. And so we've talked an awful lot about how to feed adult pollinators with the nectar and pollen. The other thing we need to consider, particularly with butterfly and moth species, is how to feed the larva or larvae. Because if we want to get adults, Of course, we first have to have the caterpillars. And caterpillars, just like our children, are rather picky eaters. I'm sure all of you have experienced this with a human child, where they will only eat one thing over and over and over, like macaroni and cheese, as my nephew here went through a phase. And this is the same with many insects. A classic example is the monarch butterfly. Their caterpillars only eat milkweeds, but there are many others that are very picky eaters and will only eat a specific species or genus of plant. And this is because they've evolved over millions of years in a certain environment where it's been beneficial to eat a certain type of plant. And so you can think about native plants as kind of like the macaroni and cheese of the landscape. For these little insects, that's the way they see it, is like, where's my macaroni and cheese? So if we want to feed the caterpillars, we have to include some of that macaroni and cheese or native plants in our landscapes. And here's just another example of a butterfly species that has particular needs for their larvae. This is the bear's hairstreak, and its larvae depend on bitterbrush. And this is a local species. Entomologists at UNR have studied populations down in downtown Reno. So it's a good reason to include some bitterbrush if you can. And just to give a few other examples of that kind of macaroni and cheese or native shrubs that provide food resources for the baby caterpillars. Here's one, the wild rose. We already talked about why it's beneficial for the adults as well. There's also red twig dogwood, another popular landscape plant that can provide resources for larvae, or all those caterpillars. Thimbleberry is another one that's really good in shade, or it's a more mountainous or higher elevation plant, so you wouldn't want to put it in a hot beating sun, but under an eave or somewhere where it gets a little part shade, that could be a really great one. Desert peach. While this plant, it does have thorns, and you're not going to want to put it in a place where people might hug it or drunkenly fall over into it. If it's put in a back corner, it can be a real showstopper. It's beautiful when it's in bloom, and it does provide resources for caterpillars. Another example is mountain mahogany. It's the taller one shown here. And just to make my point even more pronounced here, you can see from this sample in Cal Academy of Sciences that the sample actually had pieces of it eaten by a caterpillar. So just proof that it is caterpillar food. And one more to try in the landscape is chokecherry. You can find that in the Truckee Meadows in drainages. So, but it can also be planted in the landscape and provide resources both for adults and larvae. And of course, I have to mention sagebrush, our state flower, because it also provides resources for caterpillars. And similar to rabbit brush, we probably don't want to plant an entire landscape of it, and we do want to be cognizant of fire concern and not put too much of it close to our homes. But an occasional sagebrush can also provide resources for caterpillars. So we could consider it in moderation. And now that we've talked about all the kinds of plants you want to install, let's talk about where you get them. And some of the things you need to be aware of when you go to the nursery searching for them. We need to be aware of neonicotinoids, which are a class of pesticides that are systemics. They get absorbed up into the plant, and they can last for months within a plant. And then if a bee takes pollen from it or a caterpillar larva eats off of that plant, it can have detrimental effects and potentially kill them, or have the residues taken back to their hives or other populations. Neonicotinoids spell bad news for insects, basically. So what makes them a very effective pest management tool, but they're not great for our native pollinators. So when you go to a nursery, you want to make sure that the plants that you are buying haven't been treated with neonicotinoids. And if you just go to any average big box store, if you try to find staff there to tell you where were these plants sourced, it can be a little difficult because they probably don't know where they came from or if they were treated with neonicotinoids. or neonics is kind of the easier term to remember, or nickname. And so it's best, if possible, to shop at local nurseries and ask the staff where they've got the plants from and if they were treated with neonicotinoids. There's no current labeling system for this. You can find a plant and it might say it's bee friendly, and that might be true in that it provides pollen and nectar resources for pollinators, but it may have been treated with neonicotinoids. So none of the labels that just say bee friendly mean anything with that regard. So when going to local nurseries, and here's just an example, or some examples of local nurseries you can try. I'm not endorsing any particular one, and this may not be exhaustive. There may be others, but I just wanted to give you some samples. We have lots of local nurseries. And if you go to a local nursery, the staff is more likely to know where the plants came from, and you really should ask, where did you source the plants from, and are they treated with neonicotinoids? The more we ask these questions, the more they know consumers want to know, and they are more likely to find the answers and make sure that their plants aren't treated with neonicotinoids. The one labeling system we do have that you can ensure it hasn't been treated with pesticides is the USDA organic label, but unfortunately this isn't commonly used in most traditional landscape plants. You might be able to find vegetable starts that have this designation. And if so, great, then you know it doesn't have neonicotinoids, but landscape plants, you're probably just gonna have to ask. Do your best to try to make sure that local nurseries have supplies that don't have them, or don't have neonicotinoid treatments. And the other thing you can do is to start plants from seed. And although seed can also be treated with neonicotinoids, usually wildflowers and other native species, they don't treat with this. So you're pretty safe if you're getting wildflower mixes. And the one thing I would say with just kind of a little bit of caution is if you want to be planting native wildflowers, then you need to do your research, because just because it says it's a wildflower mix doesn't necessarily mean that they're native species. It could be from anywhere, really. So looking for local sources like Comstock Seed, they're one of our local seed suppliers, and you can get specific species from them that are native to the Great Basin. And there may be others. Like I said, I'm not endorsing any one product, but just trying to give people resources of places that I do know about. Okay, so we've thoroughly covered water. Moving on to food, or I just said that backwards. We've thoroughly covered food. Now let's head on to water. Because insects need water just the same as we do. And the easiest way to provide that for them is to just put out a really shallow dish with some pebbles in the bottom and a little bit of water, making sure that it's not too deep so that they can get in and get water without getting their wings wet. And these don't have to be elaborate. We don't need like huge fountains or anything, just a shallow dish. The one thing you do need to make sure is that you clean these out every week or two, because while we're trying to promote insects, the one insect we probably don't want more of in our landscape is mosquitoes. So if we clean this out at least every 14 days, we shouldn't get mosquito larvae. And moving quickly on to shelter. One of the ways we can provide shelter for insects is to leave some leaves in the landscape. And this is really about providing overwintering habitat. You can think about it as like nice little warm sleeping bags that they're gonna curl down in and hunker into for the winter months to keep warm. And the one thing I would say with a little bit of caution is I say leave some leaves, because we don't want to leave all the leaves, particularly around the foundations of our homes for fire concerns. We don't want to build up fuels and flammable materials around our homes, but leaving a few spaces that are not adjacent to your house out in the landscape can provide some of this overwintering habitat and mulch. So leaving some leaves can be really beneficial. We just don't want to go a little overboard as far as fire is concerned. We can also embrace the beauty of dormant plants in our landscape to provide shelter for insects overwintering. There are lots of insects that actually just lay their eggs in the fall. They're then going to emerge in the spring. So if they lay their eggs on those plants and then we cut it all down and send it away, then we never get those beneficial insects in the spring. So we can help promote diversity of our insect populations by leaving some dormant plants. And also there are lots of plants in the wintertime that provide seeds for bird populations. So leaving some of those, not trimming it all out. And if we have hollow stems like these shown in the middle, there are bee species that are going to lay their eggs in these hollow tubes. So we can provide those for them. So being a little bit of a messy gardener can be really beneficial for insects. Also, having rock walls that aren't cemented in place creates little cavities for nesting habitat. And there are lots of native bee species that nest in the ground. And if we provide a little bit of bare soil for them to build those nests, that can be beneficial. While mulch is really important for conserving water and suppressing weeds and other things, we don't want to put it everywhere. If we can leave at least some bare soil in some places in our landscape, this provides nesting habitat for these solitary bees. And there's also lots of bee species that are cavity nesters, and we can provide shelter for them to be able to nest in over winter in these kind of bee, I like to call them motels. I know people have seen like pictures of the enormous bee hotels that are really impressive looking. But if we've learned anything in this last year about disease, we know that when we congregate into large groups, we can spread disease around. The same is true for bee populations. So we don't want to concentrate bees into large groups. So keeping these kind of nesting habitats to a small scale is beneficial to them, just so we don't get buildup of disease in any one location. So they're fine to use, just don't go overboard. Keep them small. And do make sure that you clean them every year or two, somewhere in that realm. And the way that you do that is you provide all the nesting materials. They're going to nest in them in the fall. And then in the early spring, like right about now, before they start to emerge, which they might be depending on the species and temperature, you want to take all the materials out and place them out in the landscape in a safe place so that they can emerge. And while they're placed out there and emerging from the old materials, you're going to refill this. So then when they do emerge, they're going to find the new materials and nest in it. And it's going to be all clean. It hasn't stayed for years and years, and you don't get built up with disease and mites and things. So one other thing about these is if you're installing the different tubes, make sure they're 6 inches long. And that's because bees have adapted strategy of laying female eggs in the back and males in the front. So if there's a predator that gets in, they're going to eat the males and protects the females in the back. So if you don't have at least 6 inches, what they do is they end up laying only male eggs. And for obvious reasons, we don't want to do that. And we end up with a disproportionate population. So make sure if you're installing these, even if they're cute, because they're short, that's not beneficial to bees. They need to be at least 6 inches long. And when you look at locations for a pollinator garden, while any place is better than no place, we want to recreate habitat wherever we can. There are some ideal conditions that we should consider if possible. And the first is for looking for locations that have morning sun. And this is because pollinators need that warmth from the morning sun to get energized and get out foraging before our winds pick up in the afternoon. And speaking of winds, if you look from a bee's perspective, trying to land on this petal or this flower landing pad, we want to make sure that, or it's beneficial to them if we can locate the garden in a place that doesn't have a lot of wind, to the extent that's possible in northern Nevada. I know it's not feasible in a lot of locations, but if you have a protected area, that's better, because then they're not going to expend as much energy when they're foraging in that area. The other thing you can do as far as location is to remove some lawn and replace that with pollinator garden. And because I am generally an educator talking about how we can protect the river, I really like to promote this idea of placing your pollinator garden in between the sidewalk and the lawn, because as we've talked about, we'll go through why, we have this scenario where when we have lawns right next to sidewalks, it can run off very easily. That water goes down into the storm drain system that goes out to our local creeks and eventually the Truckee River, and it doesn't get cleaned. And if we use fertilizers in our gardens, if we use a little more than is needed, it can easily dissolve in that irrigation water, run off, go down the storm drain, where it goes out to our local waterways and can cause algae blooms. That algae gets all excited about all this food rushing into the water. It grows and grows and grows until it dies off. And then the decomposition of all that algae in the water sucks oxygen out of the water and can cause die-off of the aquatic species. So this is where the buffer strip or pollinator garden between the sidewalk and the lawn can be really beneficial. It keeps water on site. It reduces our pollutants that could wash off site. It uses water wisely because usually those pollinator plants are more water wise than lawn. And it also creates wildlife habitat. So we're really being river friendly on many different principles there if we can put in these buffer strips and incorporate pollinator plants in that zone. And when it comes to the size of our pollinator gardens, I just want to say any size is better than none. You can even start with just a pot on a patio. Wherever you can install a pollinator friendly plant, go for it. Okay, we're running short on time, so I'm going to go really quick through the second solution, which is to reduce your chemicals. Now that we've learned how to create habitat, we can also reduce our inputs of nitrogen and phosphorus. And this really has to do with protecting not specifically pollinators, but our aquatic insects. The mayflies and stoneflies that live in the river. As I've said, I'm an educator about the river. So in talking about pollinators, I also have to talk about mayflies and how important they are to our aquatic ecosystems. And nitrogen and phosphorus, as we talked about, can wash into the waterways and cause those algae blooms and negative effects. So we can reduce our phosphorus and nitrogen in many ways. One is to make sure that when you wash your car, if you can use phosphate-free soaps, or take it to a car wash. At a car wash, it gets cleaned and then the water goes to the sewer treatment plant instead of out to our waterways. So that reduces phosphates. We can also make sure that we're using fertilizers responsibly, no matter what brand we're choosing. We want to make sure that we follow the instructions carefully and we're not applying it in excess. And when possible, using organic alternatives. They have a little bit less nitrogen and phosphorus content to begin with, so we reduce the potential for them to pollute. And using strategies like grass cycling, where you mow your lawn and let the clippings, if you time it so that they're small, you let them fall in place, compost in place, add nutrients back to the soil, and then you aren't required or don't need as much fertilizer. We also want to reduce our pesticides. So we talked about this as one of the big contributing factors that entomologists think are affecting insect populations. And because this topic's a little heavy, I thought I'd add in a little bit of humor here, because as this bee points out, we can plant all the pollinator habitat in the world, but if we cover it in pesticides, we're kind of defeating the purpose. And while agricultural settings kind of get the bad rap for using a lot of chemicals, they do use pesticides in their pest management, but they do have a monetary incentive to try to reduce the amounts because those chemicals are expensive when applied across large swaths of land. Whereas in residential settings, we don't necessarily have as much of a monetary incentive. And some studies have actually found higher rates of pesticides in urban streams than in agricultural settings. Many of these pesticides are purely used for aesthetic purposes, aimed at improving the appearance of our parks and lawns, rather than providing food. So it could be argued that they're not as necessary. And they are often broad spectrum, which means they don't just kill the particular insect you're trying to get rid of, but they can also have negative effects on our native pollinator populations as well. So the best way to deal with pests is to use this strategy called integrated pest management. And the important part is chemicals are our last resort. They're the top of the triangle, the smallest part, because we want to try all these other things below. And I'm going to go through really quickly. Kevin Burrows at UNR Cooperative Extension knows a lot more about this, but I'm going to try to give you a basic overview. The first tier is prevention. And when it comes to weeds in our landscapes and being able to reduce our herbicide usage, one of the things that can really help is using thick layers of mulch, just to shade out and keep those weeds from germinating to start with. And there's a strategy called sheet mulching, where you use cardboard and newspaper and then put mulch on top of it to really shade it out. This can be effective and last for years as this decomposes. I would mention and point out, we don't want to this close to this house. In our area, we want to move it back into that safe, unflammable zone for fire safety. The next tier in integrated pest management is cultural practices. This really means using the appropriate plants that are adapted to our local climate. If they're adapted and used to low water requirements, they're more likely to be healthy and resistant to pests. So that can help reduce the need for pest control to begin with. Also using the proper amount of irrigation as a cultural practice, then we have healthy plants, once again, resistant to pests to begin with. And if you need help with your irrigation system, I really want to promote the Qualified Water Efficient Landscaper Program, national program implemented locally through the University of Nevada Cooperative Extension. And you can go on the Quell website, just Google Quell, and you can find a link on their website to find local professionals who have gone through this training and can help you do a water audit and really dial in your irrigation. Next phase or tier up of integrated pest management is physical controls. And I know for gardeners, the unfortunate thing is that means weeding. And it can be a very meditative practice and really satisfying to weed, I think, but that's only in small amounts. If you're like this guy trying to weed this entire area, it gets a little overboard and too much work. But if it's small enough, it can be very effective. And as far as pests go, there are often controls that you can use, like this earwig trap. I do it in my garden with just a yogurt container, punch some holes in the side. You fill it with water, a little bit of oil, and soy sauce, and they flock to it. It's pretty crazy. This one trap had over 500 earwigs in one night. So it's very effective control without use of pesticides. The next tier up is biological controls, which is the use of living organisms to control undesired species. And with this, I would say, well, the most common people are really familiar with is the use of ladybugs or ladybug larvae, really. They love aphids, and they'll control the one species, or one species controls the other. But, well, and there are other examples like the praying mantis. I just want to say use biological controls with caution, because once you let something alive free, it's free and it can do whatever it wants. And it doesn't necessarily control the specific species you wanted. And I think from a home gardener perspective, the better way to look at biological controls rather than releasing specific species is instead to just promote biodiversity within your garden. Because if you have lots of different species, hopefully they will help control each other and no one species will get really high population. So just try to promote diversity in your gardens. And that last top of the integrated pest management triangle there is chemicals. And it's at the top because it's our last resort. We only go to this and use it in the least amount possible when we've exhausted all of the other things below. And we want to make sure that when we apply any kind of pesticides that we are following the instructions. It's required by law. And I just want to point out a lot of, you might have noticed I don't include a ton of text in my slides because I don't want people reading. But in this instance, I want to point out that this is really where you need to read the fine print. When it comes to the labels on pesticides, you need to read it all. It's what's required, and then you have to follow the instructions. And I just wanted to point out that a lot of these and it's not this one in particular, there's lots of different products that are 2-in-1 systemic, where they are a fertilizer as well as an insecticide in one product. But those insecticides, if they're systemic, are usually the neonicotinoids, which we talked about are very detrimental to our pollinator populations. And I just want to point out this particular label. It says this product is highly toxic to aquatic invertebrates. Do not apply directly to water. To protect the environment, do not allow pesticide to enter or run off to storm drains, drainage ditches, gutters, or surface waters. Applying this product in calm weather when rain is not predicted for the next 24 hours will help to ensure that wind or rain does not blow or wash pesticide off the treatment area. Sweeping any product that lands on driveways, sidewalks, or street back into the treated area of the lawn or garden will help to prevent runoff to water bodies or drainage systems. So really important point, this is highly toxic to those aquatic invertebrates, the mayflies and the stoneflies. So follow these instructions if you're going to use these products. And one other note about labeling of pesticides, the EPA does have this new label. So if you see this B on any kind of pesticide product, this is an advisory label that has specific instructions and use restrictions with regards to how to protect bees and other insect populations. So be on the lookout for this and read those very carefully. And with that, I just want to say that what I'm really trying to get everybody to think about here is that maybe we should accept a few more dandelions in our lives. Maybe not as many as this photo shows, but I want us to all work with nature instead of against it, so that we may have some of this natural beauty here in the Truckee Meadows to share with all of the future generations. That is my overview of how to promote pollinators in your river-friendly landscape. And just to kind of give an overview to make sure you really hit it home, the two major things you need to do is to create habitat with providing food, water, and shelter. And the second is to reduce our chemical usage, both the nitrogen and phosphorus that affects our aquatic ecosystems and also pesticides that affect them all. And looping back on that One Truckee River management plan, we talked about a lot of those goals in the beginning. We talked about how we need to make sure that we're delivering the cleanest water possible to our storm drain system. We've talked about that a little bit with reducing our fertilizer usage and putting those buffer plantings in to prevent any overspray from our lawns. We've also talked about how to improve the wildlife habitat throughout our watershed. And that last goal was to make sure that we are promoting a culture of stewardship. And this is really where, at the end here, I want to call you all to action and get you to help me spread the word, because we can all act as individuals, and that's great. We all should go into our landscapes and make the changes that we can, but we can help promote the whole thing and grow it by spreading the word to others. Because there's only one of me, and I can't possibly get this message out to everybody within the Truckee Meadows. It's going to take the whole community. So I really need all of you to help me with that message after the class. And since we're living in a digital world, one of the easiest ways to do that right now is to use social media, because we don't have to gather with people to do that. So if you go to One Truckee River Facebook and Instagram pages, I have lots of river-friendly landscaping tips on there that you can share with others. And so my call to action to you is to go to one of those, follow us, and share it. And just general disclaimer, it's educational use only, the information that I provided. Use it at your own risk. Make sure you follow local codes and ordinances and consult with professionals if you need help. And with that, I'm going to launch our feedback poll that I talked about at the beginning. And it should just take a minute or two. It's only 4 questions. And like I said, it's anonymous. So if you guys can just take one moment to fill that in, let me know what you thought of the class. It'll be a great help. And I'll put up here on the screen my contact information while you guys are working on that. If you end up with having questions after the talk, feel free to contact me. And I'm happy to help with any kind of questions people have on this topic or anything river related. And I've also got One Truckee River's contact information up there too. So follow us on social media, keep in touch with what's happening on the river, not just on the river-friendly landscaping front, but all the other issues that One Truckee River is working on as well.